The World Economic Forum recently hosted the first in-person Davos meeting in more than 2 years, and you can catch up with the action on our podcasts. Radio Davos, which looks at the world's biggest challenges and how we might solve them, long-form interviews on Meet the Leader, and bringing you the complete audio from some of the most fascinating discussions in Davos, Agenda Dialogues. You'll hear some of the world's sharpest minds, like Tom Friedman, who's asked, is globalization dead?
If World War I didn't stop globalization, if World War II didn't stop globalization, what makes you think the war between Ukraine and Russia is going to stop globalization?
The biggest economists, like the IMF's Geeta Gopinath on the future of economic growth.
I've heard people worry about wages going up is a problem because that can feed into inflation. This is to be very clear. Prices going up is inflation. We certainly could see an environment where wages go up, but that doesn't have to necessarily generate a wage price spiral.
Psychologist Adam Grant on the 4-day week.
And we want to plan work around life as opposed to vice versa, which too many of us, particularly in the West, have done for too long. Is the 4-day week actually viable?
In discussions moderated by A-list journalists challenging the consensus.
2021 we were told that this was transitory inflation. 2022, the beginning of, we were told this is transitory inflation. The causes of that inflation were misdiagnosed.
Wherever you get your podcasts, to listen in on the action at Davos 2022, subscribe to Agenda Dialogues.
It sort of sounds a bit like science fiction, but it's also actually a fairly almost logical evolution in the sort of trajectory of the internet.
Welcome to Radio Davos, the podcast from the World Economic Forum that looks at the biggest challenges and how we might solve them. This week, Nick Clegg, President for Global Affairs at Meta, tells us what exactly is the metaverse.
We'll be able to talk to each other as holograms, really feeling that we are sitting in the same space, even though we're not physically there. So this real sense of embodied presence.
Nick Clegg tells us that while Facebook has become Meta, it has no plans to go it alone into this brave new future, where there will be, he says, space for all.
Breathe easily. The ambition of Meta and Mark Zuckerberg is not to create some sort of empire in the sky which will be owned by Meta and governed by one company. Far from it. The metaverse will come into being, candidly, regardless of whether we as a company are pinning our colours to it or not.
But creating a metaverse where users can travel freely and aren't locked into any company's particular ecosystem will take some work. And that at a time when some people worry about the splintering of the internet itself.
There's a danger that we might look back in 10 years' time and think that this is actually the high point of the open global internet. We're taking it for granted, and once it's gone, I think we will lament its loss. We really will.
Subscribe to Radio Davos wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a rating and a review, and join us on the World Economic Forum Podcast Club on Facebook. I'm Robin Pomeroy at the World Economic Forum, and with this conversation with Nick Clegg recorded at the Forum's annual meeting 2022 in Davos.
It's a very interesting challenge, which certainly keeps me very busy.
This is Radio Davos. Radio Davos has just come back from Davos. We were podcasting daily from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting 2022. Please check our previous episodes to catch up on all that. While in Davos, we were grabbing lots of interviews with the people there, leaders from business, international organisations, campaign groups and more. And we'll be bringing you those in the coming weeks here on Radio Davos and also on our sister podcast, Meet the Leader. This week's episode of Radio Davos is one of those interviews. I spoke to Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK and now President for Global Affairs at Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook. He had plenty to say about the metaverse, something which was also highly visible in Davos. Meta and Microsoft both had metaverse experiences in Davos where people could get a taste of what it's like to enter a virtual reality or augmented reality space. But even then, many of us are still left wondering what will this technology really be used for in the coming years. This interview was recorded at Davos 2022 and therefore before the news that Sheryl Sandberg is stepping down as Chief Operating Officer at Meta. So let's hear Nick Clegg speaking to me at the Radio Davos booth in Davos. I'm delighted to welcome to Radio Davos Nick Clegg. Nick, how are you?
I'm very well.
And now you became President for Global Affairs with seniority right at the top of the company a few months ago. What does that mean, and what is it that you actually do these days?
Yeah, so as Mark Zuckerberg explained at the time, he it's a big company. It's erupted in size in the last decade and a half. As he explained at the time, he wants to very much devote his time to most especially to the huge engineering task of helping to build this new computing platform, the so-called metaverse, and really wants to quite rightly focus his energies on that. Sheryl Sandberg, COO, is very much focused on the commercial side of things, and we're facing more competition than we ever have before. And as Mark explained at the time, he's asked me to really deal with, in a sense, the rest. But what I mean by the rest is all the major regulatory, policy, and other issues that the company faces with, and that ranges from me being the sort of senior decision maker on some of the most difficult issues, like where do we draw the line between free expression and content that we take down? How do we operate our platforms at the time of elections? Through to talking to people and policymakers and regulators about our plans for the metaverse, talking to regulators and legislators around the world as they introduce new rules for the internet. So that, in a nutshell, is the sort of division of labour, if you like, which Mark Zuckerberg explained at the time. And it's a very interesting challenge, which certainly keeps me very busy.
Let me fire. I really want to talk to you about the metaverse,
Meta
and the metaverse. But before we do that, I want to fire a kind of a potentially regulatory question to you. In January, we had an episode of Radio Davos where we interviewed Stuart Russell, who's a professor, expert of artificial intelligence. And his position is that the social media algorithms have, and I think I'm quoting directly here, have learned to manipulate people to change them so that in future they're more susceptible and they can be monetized at a higher rate. It's quite an assertion. Do you agree with him?
It's an assertion which is often made and very rarely proven, for the very good reason that's not what our algorithms do. It's certainly a sort of fashionable narrative, isn't it, to say that companies like Meta, but we're not alone. The accusation is that we use algorithms to sort of craftily spoon feed extreme and hateful content to people to keep them hooked on our services, because that's the way that we can sell ads and so on. Really, every link in that chain is wrong. Actually, what our algorithms do, if you took our algorithms away, what is the first thing you'd see more of on Facebook? You'd see more misinformation, more hate speech, because our algorithms actually, amongst other things, act as great big sort of swimming pool filters, if you like, trying to filter out, identify, and demote exactly the kind of content we don't want to promote. And by the way, for those who keep alleging, and I don't know whether this good professor did so, but it is often alleged that we have a commercial incentive to do so. If you think of it,
by the way.
Yes, exactly. That's the
He didn't mention you by name.
No. But what I mean is, I can imagine the narrative because it's an oft repeated one. But if you actually think about it, our commercial incentive is the reverse. Because why would any advertiser who's placing ads online want their ad for soap powder next to a piece of hateful or extreme content? So we don't want it. The people who pay our lunch, the advertisers, don't want it. And crucially, we know from our own research that users don't want it. And look, don't just take my word for it. We now do something which no other social media platform does. We publish every 12 weeks statistics on how we're doing in algorithmically and otherwise identifying and suppressing, or sometimes even removing, this kind of nefarious content. And we have submitted, no one's done this before, we've submitted our data, which for instance shows that the prevalence of hate speech is now down to 0.003%. That means for every 10,000 bits of content you'd see, if you constantly scroll on Facebook, you'd see 3 bits of hate speech. I wish it wasn't 3. I don't think it's ever going to get down to 0, but it's a much, much lower than it was before. And we have submitted that data to an independent audit. The independent auditor, EY, has audited it and verified that these are sound statistics. So I don't candidly believe that this, however often repeated it might be, this narrative of how algorithms work on social media really withstands much scrutiny. That said, I do think companies like Meta, it is an obligation on us, and we haven't yet done as much as we no doubt will in the years ahead. We do need to explain algorithms better, make them more transparent, give users more control over how, at the moment there is you can literally, with a swipe of your thumb, you can turn off the algorithm and only see the content of your news feed presented to you chronologically. But I do think we'll need to do more of that, because transparency really is the best way to kind of dispel some of the mythology that has already grown up around algorithms.
Okay, from algorithms to Meta then. A lot of people never heard the word metaverse before Facebook became Meta. So what is the metaverse, and what will we be doing in it in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years' time?
Well, the metaverse is in many ways, it sort of sounds a bit like science fiction, but it's also actually a fairly almost logical evolution in the sort of trajectory of the internet. If you think that, we used to have desktops, and then we had laptops, and then we migrated from laptops, and now we all walk around with clutching a phone in our clammy hands, and then we went from text to photographs, and photographs to videos, and now videos is now by far, short form videos in particular, hugely popular way by which people communicate and share things. About 50% of the content on Facebook is video already. And all of that is a move towards greater, it's almost lifelike embodiment. And the metaverse is the sort of natural extrapolation of that, where over time you and I would be able to put something on the bridge of our nose, some not heavy goggles, there'll be glasses then, maybe with something around your wrist to provide more computing power, and we'd be able to talk to each other as holograms, really feeling that we are sitting in the same space, even though we're not physically there. So this real sense of embodied presence, and it's remarkable. I mean, it sounds very futuristic, but it's remarkable how much progress has already been made in filling out this dream. I mean, I, for instance, for several months now, have been holding my weekly team meetings with my team around the world in the metaverse. Now, we don't look like holograms. We look like we're sort of slightly cartoon avatar representations of ourselves. I look suspiciously slimmer and younger. That's the avatar I've chosen for myself. So you can provide quite a flattering description of yourself. But it nonetheless provides a remarkably sort of lifelike experience, because particularly the audio technology is so great. You really do feel that you don't need to raise your voice like people do when they're speaking at a flat screen full of people on Zoom or other technologies presented to you in those passport squares. So the idea is of a sort of embodied presence, and if you can imagine what could be done with that technology in the future, it would obviate the need for mass commuting into offices, because we'd be able to work together as if we were in offices together without having to commute physically. It would allow teachers to take a class of 12-year-olds to walk around ancient Rome. It would allow a surgeon to educate a group of budding medical students on how to do surgery as if they're right there in the lab. I think the applications really are very exciting. But you ask, in 1, 5, 10 years, this is a long journey. This is not going to happen overnight. And I think one of the exciting things, certainly for people like me, is that we can have the ethical, moral, societal, regulatory debates now, rather than bolting them on as an afterthought, which is what we've done, if you like, with the first kind of wave of the internet. I think if we can have those debates, the technological engineering and the kind of ethical regulatory debates in parallel, that will bode well for the future.
You set out a lot of these things in this essay that I'm holding in my
Yes.
hand here, Making the Metaverse, What Is It, How It Will Be Built and Why It Matters.
I'm glad and impressed you got through it.
I did bedtime reading last night. One of the things I found very interesting, one of the many things, was this idea. I think when Facebook became Meta, some people thought, right, they're going to be the metaverse. That's it. And the point you make very strongly here is this is the interlinking of the various metaverses. Or could you give us some explanation of how you see kind of the architecture, or you've even built a little diagram in there. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
And it's terribly important, this. I mean, everyone should breathe easily. The ambition of Meta and Mark Zuckerberg is not to create some sort of empire in the sky, which will be owned by Meta and governed by one company. Far from it. The metaverse will come into being, candidly, regardless of whether we as a company are pinning our colours to it or not. We are just going to be one of many companies who are investing heavily in the technology. So's Microsoft and Google and Apple and so on. And I think here's the thing. It won't be sort of one thing. No one talks about the Google Internet or the Microsoft Internet. There are certainly only at the moment a couple of operating systems, iOS and Android. I actually think that the metaverse could become a slightly more diverse sort of patchwork, if you like, of operating systems, upon which then different floors in a building, upon which then different companies will build different experiences, either sort of worlds and experiences which people can join in a semi-public space, or places where you and I could book a room and have a private conversation. might be held on the server of Meta, but it'll be very much a private space which doesn't really belong to anyone else, other than ourselves. And to your question, I think the key thing to consider now, early on, before sort of facts are already baked into the cake of the technology, is to make sure that patchwork quilt doesn't become too segmented, so that as a user, you can move from one part of the metaverse to the other. I'm an Arsenal fan. I very much hope Arsenal. I doubt it's going to happen, but very much hope Arsenal today will qualify for Champions League. And I would then want to buy a celebratory Arsenal shirt in the metaverse. And I'd want to go from one part of the metaverse to the other. Maybe go with some friends to hear some music, or go with some friends to a discussion group. And I think it will be key for users to be able to move seamlessly from one part of the metaverse to the other. And for that, you will need a complex but essential web of rules, standards, interoperable interfaces, which may be forged by the industry, by standard setting bodies, possibly by regulators as well. And it's one point which I think is crucial, because if we don't do that, I think the promise of the metaverse could be squandered by what may turn out to be a splinterverse. People talk about the splinter net, which is certainly a real risk. I think there is equally a real risk, if we're not attentive to this, that you see in the future, in many years to come, a splinterverse. And that would be a great shame.
It's quite different from what we have now. I mean, we have the World Economic Forum podcast. We have the World Economic Forum podcast club on Facebook, which I urge everyone to join. But you have to be on Facebook to get there.
Yeah.
What you're saying in the metaverse, you could still have that, but you could also have something where people could arrive in that room and that discussion group from different parts of the metaverse or the internet.
Correct, exactly. I think it'd be a great shame if we all. I mean, look, candidly, I think we're already in danger in the current sort of setup on the internet to have too many sort of walled gardens. So if I'm not doing this to throw them under the bus, but if you look at the kind of walled garden that Apple is highly successful, they sell the fancy hardware, they run the operating system, and now they also sell you the services, the music, the television, and so on. And there's a huge sort of pull for people to be locked into that kind of Apple world and not escape from it. And I don't think we should repeat that mistake in the metaverse. I think we should allow users and empower users to move more easily from the metaverse to the Apple metaverse to the Microsoft metaverse in the future.
And at a meeting like this, is that the kind of thing that would be discussed? You'll meet people from, in senior positions from those companies. You're going to meet regulators from all over the world and politicians. Are those discussions happening now to say, okay, we need to get together to ensure this will be interoperable, or start the conversation going on that?
Yeah, and the World Economic Forum is playing a really important catalytic role, which is that, as will be announced this week, the World Economic Forum is sort of hosting and running a forum which will bring together academics, thinkers, regulators, online safety experts, people like me from Meta, my counterparts from Google, Microsoft, and smaller companies too, to start having this conversation. Because candidly, we're only just starting to have the conversation, which is, principally my motivation for writing this piece, which is to sort of start trying to kind of get the ball rolling in these kind of discussions. And I think it's great that the World Economic Forum is helping to kind of host that discussion, because that's the kind of thing we need if we're going to anticipate the need for those rules in the years to come.
In the metaverse, are the risks that are already there in the internet as we know it today of hate speech, bullying, privacy problems, perhaps government surveillance, all these risks that are there, will that be greater for any reason in the metaverse?
Well, you'll always have those issues with any sort of form of communication, any form of sort of technological communication. But I think it's very important to remember how different this technology will be to what we're used to. And one concern I have is that people think that the solution to those legitimate concerns about safety, about unpleasant content, about so on and so forth, is to sort of just copy and paste the rule book that either governments or regulators or companies such as ours have developed over the years to keep people safe on our platform, because it's a very different way of communicating. When you post on Facebook, it's there, it stays there. People share it, it circulates, it goes viral on the internet. communication on the metaverse, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, will be much more like everyday life. Ephemeral, just you say it and then it disappears. It's not, no one keeps a record of it. And you wouldn't, in a sense, want either the government or Mark Zuckerberg or any regulators kind of peering over your shoulder, monitoring every word you say in real time, just as you wouldn't want that when you're just having a chat with a mate in a pub. One of the very sort of cornerstones of freedom is that we can sort of talk nonsense to each other in privacy, in our own living rooms, or in other places where we congregate. And I think particularly for those private spaces in the metaverse, that's the way you need to think about it. I think in the more public spaces, there'll be some more open places where people congregate. I think there the rules will be a little bit more familiar or will feel a little bit more familiar to what we have now. But I think in those private spaces, 5 people get together to play chess, and one of them has got some seriously odious political views that might, if he expressed them on Facebook, would fall foul of our rules. You wouldn't want Facebook charging and saying, "Aha, no, you can't say that," while you're just, moving the knight two shifts up the chessboard. So we'll need to construct a different conceptual framework by which we decide who is responsible to monitor and enforce those rules at what level of the stack. If I referred earlier to this kind of picture of the like the floors of a house. And I think the responsibilities will lie with sort of different entities at different levels of that stack.
Is there anything you'd like to see either in your own domain or in the wider world that's been discussed here that you'd like to see come out of this annual meeting at Davos?
When it comes to the metaverse, you mean?
No, I mean you could pick that or anything else.
Oh well, I think like everybody here, the horrific bloodshed and conflict in Ukraine looms larger than anything else. So I like everybody else will be listening out for people who've got insights into that conflict, and of course it takes place at a time when. The early promise of a seamless, borderless, globalized economic order is fraying at the edges. And one of the great ironies, I think, of our age is that technology and economics pushes towards globalization, but politics and conflict propel society in the opposite direction. And you can see that in the internet. I mean, there is a real danger, as I said earlier, that the internet is fragmenting, is balkanizing. You have a Chinese internet, you have a Russian internet, you have a Turkish internet, you have a Vietnamese internet. It is sort of, I think there's a danger that we might look back in 10 years' time and think that this is actually the high point of the open global internet. So I will certainly be listening out, particularly for decision makers, to hear how committed they are to try and really keep data flows open, keep the global internet open, because we're taking it for granted. And once it's gone, I think we will lament its loss. We really will.
Nick Clegg, President for Global Affairs at Meta. Thanks for joining us on Radio Davos.
Thank you.
Please subscribe to Radio Davos wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating and a review, and join the conversation on the World Economic Forum Podcast Club on Facebook. This episode of Radio Davos was presented by me, Robin Pomeroy. Sound engineering was by Juan Toron, and studio production was by Gareth Nolan. We'll be back next week, but for now, thanks to you for listening and goodbye.